Domain 5, Task 1, it reads, evaluate the attributes of identified risks using advanced quantitative tools and specialized qualitative techniques in order to estimate overall risk exposure of the project.
Okay, so we've got a new subject here, which is part of our specialized risk analyses that the risk professional is going to contribute to the project that we wouldn't expect the normal project manager or a normal project control manager or a project office to be able to do. And that is evaluating overall project risk exposure. Now, if we look in the PMBOK guide in chapter 11, we've actually got a double definition of risk. And so this is interesting. When you ask people what does the PMBOK guide say about defining risk, they'll say this, and I can say it without looking. A risk is an uncertain event or condition that, if it occurs, has a positive or negative effect on one or more project objectives. That is an individual event or condition which is uncertain, and it could affect the objectives if it happens. So that's not overall risk. That's an individual thing, like the supplier goes bust, or we find a new methodology for our software design. So that's an individual threat or opportunity. But what about evaluating the overall risk exposure of the project, which is what this task talks about? Right at the beginning of the chapter 11 of the PMBOK guide, we have a section called Key Concepts for Project Risk Management. And here we find two definitions. So we've got one of them, individual project risk, which is what we quoted, the uncertain event or condition that, if it occurs, affects objectives. But we've also got a second definition, overall project risk. Overall project risk is the effect of uncertainty on the project as a whole, not individual events, but the whole project. The effect of uncertainty on the project as a whole arising from all sources of uncertainty, including individual risks, but not just individual risks. So it's all sources of uncertainty, variation, ambiguity, emergent risk, all sorts of things that could affect the project, not just the individual risk events. And this represents the exposure of stakeholders to the implications of variations in project outcome, positive or negative. So we've got two definitions here, individual risks that we record in the risk register, and overall project risk, which answers the question, how risky is my project? And when I very first started out in risk management, way back in the 1980s, and I produced my first risk register, which had, I think, about 27 risks in it, and some of them were red, and some of them were yellow, and some were green. And I gave it to my project manager, and he took it to the project sponsor. And he said, this is very nice. Is it okay? I said, what do you mean, is it okay? He said, well, is my project high risk, low risk? Is it acceptable? What does this mean? How risky is my project? And I realized that I couldn't answer that question by giving him the risk register to say there's 7 red risks and there's 12 amber risks and there's 15 green. How does that tell me how risky my project is? Is that high risk? I don't know. And that made me start thinking about this question of overall project risk way back in the 80s. And it took me years to work out how to actually answer that question. Well, now I think we've got an answer, and it's not just me. Now we have this in the PMBOK guide. It's in the practice standard, which was published some time ago. It has exactly the same thing. We need to manage both individual risks and overall project risk exposure. And so in the PMBOK guide and in the practice standard, we have response strategies for overall project risk. We have ways of identifying overall project risk exposure. And that's what this task is saying, that the risk specialist on the project should be understanding how to evaluate overall project risk exposure and how to respond to it using specialized techniques that are beyond the risk register.
Okay.
So that means we need to think about things like risk efficiency. So if I take this much risk and I get this much reward or benefit to the project, if I took more risk, would I get more reward? Where is the point where I'm taking so much risk that it becomes unsustainable, even if it gave me more reward? Or I'm going to invest this much in the project, and in order to get this reward out, I need to take this much risk. If I want to get more benefits from the project, I'll have to take more risk. At what point is it that in order to take in order to get more benefits, I'm taking an unacceptable level of risk. So the risk efficiency index is the trade-off between risk and reward. That expresses how the overall risk exposure of the project. And that's something that a risk specialist perhaps would know, how to calculate a risk efficiency index. And it comes from the work of an economist, actually, Harry Markowitz, in 1952, when he was talking about managing financial portfolios. And how do we know if our portfolio is risk efficient? You have a range of different elements, investments in your portfolio. Some of them are high risk, high return. Some are low risk, low return. How do we have a risk efficient portfolio? And that idea of risk efficiency is now being played into projects. And so we can think about how we might have a risk efficient portfolio of projects or a risk efficient portfolio of activities within the project. And so that's an advanced technique, the risk efficiency index, which maybe a risk specialist might take care of. Then we've got things like metrics trend analysis, which we've talked about already in other domains. Something called connectivity analysis. So we're looking at the way that risks relate to each other. And because if one risk happens, it might make 5 other risks occur and make 3 other risks impossible. That's the sort of advanced analysis across the breadth of risks within the project that the risk specialist could undertake if they know how to do it by building a connectivity matrix of risks, and then say, because of the relationships between our risks, that puts the project at more exposure or less exposure. We might think about Monte Carlo analysis, not just of individual risks, but against the overall project objectives. We might think about techniques like real options. Again, an advanced quantitative technique looking at the overall risk exposure of our whole project. Now, these are really specialized techniques. They're things that are within the risk professional's armory or toolbox that you could come to your project manager or sponsor and use these techniques to answer the question, how risky is my project, by evaluating overall project risk.
Wow.
Now, in the PMBOK guide, because we've now got that definition of overall project risk, we start to describe throughout the processes in the PMBOK guide how you might do that. How do you identify sources of overall project risk? How do you evaluate the exposure level of overall project risk exposure? How do you respond to overall project risk exposure? All those things are in the PMBOK guide, but implementing them requires specialist tools and techniques that really are the domain of the risk professional.
No doubt. And I'm sure that there are sources perhaps on your site where people can get further information if they wanted to explore the breadth of connectivity analysis or risk efficiency index and stuff like that.
Yes, and these are techniques that, you might look at the Institute of Risk Management, for example, which is the professional body for risk management, or some of the other professional bodies, GARP, the Global Association of Risk Professionals, SRA, the Society for Risk Analysis. Some of these, will be good resources for learning these advanced techniques. And it's something that, you develop with experience. I never knew about these things in the 1980s or 90s. And then over 30 years of, working in risk management, you realize, actually, this could be a useful technique. I'd better find out about it. And it's a continuous learning process.
Gotcha. Well, definitely not for the faint-hearted. This is specialized risk analysis. One of the words that jumps out here is advanced quantitative tools, and now you probably know why. Well, that concludes task 1. When we come back, we're going to take a look at task 2.